Hello, my name's Mark Armstrong. I'm going to be talking to you today about a great tune called A Night in Tunisia. So, as you probably know, this was written by Dizzy Gillespie in about 1942, and it's become one of the most popular and well-covered jazz standards of all time. Dizzy Gillespie originally wrote the tune with the title Interlude, and that's partly because it's got an interlude. That interlude is the famous bit that happens at the end of the main part of the form. I mean, the thing that's also quite interesting is that in various different early versions of it, there's a second interlude as well. So it's not just, it's all about the one interlude. The story goes about the title that he called it Interlude originally, which sounds a bit boring as for the name of a jazz tune. And one of the band leaders that he was working with, and it might have been Earl Hines, because he played in the Earl Hines Orchestra during the war, or it might have been Benny Carter, apparently suggested that it would be better to have a more sort of topical title. And since this was in the middle of the Second World War, and apparently about the same time as the Battle of El Alamein, the title A Night in Tunisia was suggested as being a better one for the tune. And the way that it alternates between a kind of Latin, sort of vaguely African, I suppose, groove, a little bit like Caravan, which of course refers to Arabic caravan, as opposed to the caravan that you take down the M5 and then jackknife and leave in the hard shoulder. It's that kind of caravan. It has that kind of reference to African music, and as we all know, of course, jazz has its origin in African grooves, African performance practices, African ways of embellishment, African ways of controlling your instrument, African ways of involving everyone in performance. So sounds pretty appropriate to me. And I suppose the interesting thing about this as well is that the bebop period, and particularly going on into the hard bop period in the 1950s, marks a point where black people in America, who obviously, were the innovators in the music, started to rediscover a stronger connection to their African roots, and this gets injected into the music. Whereas, when it first started, in the time of slavery at the start of the 20th century, automatically a lot of the influences that you find in original African music find their way into the start of jazz, along with various other things from European music to make the melting pot, and that beautiful combination of different things that makes the music so attractive, despite the fact that it's kind of born out of a bit of adversity. But particularly after the Second World War, a lot of black Americans felt that they were pretty fed up with this being a time when their civil rights were once again not being respected, especially having gone for a second time to fight for Uncle Sam over in Europe, and still coming back to find that they were expected to sit at the back of the bus, and that segregation was still going on. So bebop, which was the music, as you probably know, around at the time at the end of the 30s, going on into the 40s, was partly part of a wider sort of intellectual movement amongst black Americans, and it was about the music being something that people did for themselves, as opposed to being something that was supposed to be entertaining for a possibly predominantly white audience, as might have been the case at the Cotton Club, for example, a decade earlier. So, of course, you're invited to come and listen and take part, but this music isn't going to be kind of dumbed down or altered to suit an audience that might not be able to deal with its complexity or where it's coming from. So that's a kind of bit of historical background, I guess, to where this music's coming from at the time. So anyway, it gets renamed A Night in Tunisia from the title Interlude, although if you listen to the tracks that I've provided on the playlist that goes along with this, you'll hear that there is actually a version of this being sung by Sarah Vaughan with the lyric Interlude. On top of that, you'll also find a version which is sung by Chaka Khan, using, A Night in Tunisia. And in both cases, what's really interesting to me about that is how the baton is always passed between instrumentalists and vocal performers when you listen to jazz. Originally, jazz instrumentalists got their style from blues performances by blues singers, who of course get their vocal style from African ways of using the voice. And that's the thing that changes the way you play an instrument to suit a jazz style from something that's being played in, I suppose, a classical way. So having all that colour in your tone comes from the blues voice. And then as instrumental music develops, what you start to get is that sense that instrumentalists develop the style, and then the more sophisticated jazz vocalists come along and they maybe add a lyric to what was originally devised as an instrumental tune, or even a solo. So you get vocalese, or you get lyrics which fit with solos, and all that kind of stuff shows how there's this really rich connection between what you hear when you hear a vocal performance, what you hear when you hear an instrumental performance. So anyway, that's a bit of a background to where the tune comes from. Obviously, you can have a look at the tune in one of the many real book lead sheets that you can find. The one from the original lead sheet, which hopefully might be popping up behind me on this screen at some point, is a really good place to start. And the good thing about that is that it's got sufficient amount of information to make a pretty decent performance of A Night in Tunisia just by reading the notes. However, as I'm sure you're aware, we don't want to rely on notated music to play jazz. Jazz is an oral art form, and you're best off basing your research on listening to lots of different versions of this tune. Particularly, this is the case if you want to play an American songbook tune that's become a jazz standard, like, I don't know, All the Things You Are, something like that. If you play the notes the way they're written out on the lead sheet, it's going to sound really stilted and lacking any kind of groove and rhythm. You need to embellish the tune. The thing that's great about the lead sheet for A Night in Tunisia, if you want to use it, is that it's got the right kind of rhythmic structure built in, because after all, this was originally devised to be an instrumental standard, not a vocal standard with the lyric taken away. The lyrics are added later. So what I suggest you do is check out the different versions that are on that lead sheet. The different versions that are in the YouTube link. Have a look at the lead sheet if you need to, and listen and see what you notice, and that'll help you to get to know the tune while you're trying to learn it and play it. One other thing to say in this introduction is just to talk a little bit about the form of the tune. So the original form of the tune has an introduction, which is a kind of looping 4/8 bar type thing, goes into an AABA form, which is your standard issue way that a lot of jazz tunes are organised. And this shows you how a lot of these instrumental jazz standards have a kind of link to tunes like I Got Rhythm, which are vocal tunes originally, but use this AABA form, and they're transposed and reused because this is a familiar format for jazz musicians, and it makes sense to write your own tune based on a form like that, in exactly the same way that it makes sense to write an original tune over the top of a chord sequence like I Got Rhythm. So there's a connection there. So we've got the AABA form, but then crucially, before the solos is this section called the interlude. And for example, on the famous alto break, if you're familiar with this is a recording with Charlie Parker. You'll hear that Charlie Parker is captured with the band playing the break, and then playing this incredible. Playing the interlude, and then playing this famous alto break before going into the rest of his solo. The rest of that track hasn't remained in evidence, I don't think, and that's partly because apparently there were a few mistakes earlier on in the tune, so that didn't make it to become a take. But that the way that he plays over that break is so incredible, it's worth checking that out on its own. So have a listen to some recordings, and that's going to be a great way to get started with learning what's going on in this tune.